When we hear the phrase Homeland Security, we usually think of the United States. But long before 9/11, Israel was already building a model, one based on occupation, surveillance, and control. After the 2008 Mumbai attacks, India promised it would never be caught off guard again. But instead of rebuilding from within, it became one of Israel's biggest customers. Not just for weapons, but for surveillance technology, police training, and an entire mindset shaped by Israel's experience of occupation. In today's episode of the Brown History Podcast, we sit with Rhys Machold, author of Fabricating Homeland Security, and unpack how Homeland Security became a global brand, how fear became a marketplace, and how Israel became India's go-to model for policing, surveillance, and counterterrorism. Before we get started, if you believe in what we do, please consider supporting the podcast, subscribe to our newsletter, become a Patreon. We don't shy away from the truth, and in today's world that often brings backlash. Your support tells us the struggle is not in vain, the voice still matters, the truth still matters. Thank you. Before we get started, I really want to dive in on this concept of Homeland Security. I really want to define what it is and how people see it, because to most, I think Homeland Security sounds defensive. It sounds something good. It's branded as a defensive institution, and if you go on the website of any country, Homeland Security would mean, safeguarding the people, the homeland, the values against threats like terrorisms and disasters, virus, cyber attacks. In theory, it's all about protection. It's all about helping the people. So I really want to unpack that and unmask it and really just, see it for what it is.
So, as you've already kind of alluded to, there are reasons why it's generally viewed that way. As I'm sure some of your listeners will be aware, the term Homeland Security is something that really didn't exist prior to the September 11th attacks in 2001. And in the aftermath, among many other things that the United States did, was create this thing called the Department of Homeland Security in 2002. And so since then, Homeland Security has sort of been synonymous with what all the things you said, sort of protecting the homeland, protecting ordinary people from various kinds of threat, particularly things that are associated with so-called terrorism. But I guess what the book tries to do is to take a second and try to think about, where does this term actually come from? What are the kinds of projects that is sort of fundamentally involved in, and should we sort of take it at its word as sort of a good thing that's in all of our respective public interests? And I think the book in various ways suggests that, Homeland Security and security in general is not all that it seems. But I sort of argue that it's useful to think about the way it's sort of pieced together or stitched together, or in the words of the book, sort of fabricated, both within particular places like the United States in the aftermath of 9/11, but also across different jurisdictions and geographies, and trying to think about sort of how it comes together to look whole and seamless and perfect, and possibly even to be a good thing. So yeah, through the way
Right.
that the book sort of weaves that together, I think I tell a slightly different story about Homeland Security from the one that we're more familiar with. Yeah.
You brought it up. The title of your book is Fabricating Homeland Security. Can you break down what you mean by fabricating? Are you saying that it's something built, something made up, or both?
Certainly both. And I mean that I went with that term for a variety of reasons, but one of the things that I think is quite helpful about it is we can, you know, things that are real in the world also have kind of illusory or elusive qualities or mythic qualities. But I think it's a mistake to simply say that it's simply in our heads, or it's simply a product of our imagination. So what fabrication tries to do in some ways is to take seriously its kind of ideological and ideational aspects in terms of what people believe about it or how they come to understand it as such, but also the ways that it's materially put together, so the literal things that we associate with the Homeland Security state, things like surveillance systems and so on, weapons, that kind of stuff. And basically, I suggest that, to understand it as fabricated is to take seriously that it is both made and made up, and also kind of woven together across expanses of the world, and the way that it sort of comes to appear as a product of those stitchings together, and also sort of ideological production as a kind of project of state power.
Can we take that and use India as an example? You start the book with the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which people would describe it as India's 9/11. How did that moment change for India about security and policing, and how did Homeland Security for India change? What was that, what was actually the shift in those years that followed?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. So, I mean, the reason I start in 2008 after the Mumbai attacks, which is often known, as you said, as India's 9/11 or simply as 26/11, in India. I think what's particularly interesting about that event is that that was a massive attack that was widely covered on international media as well as within India itself and around the world. But those types of attacks, sort of major attacks on major cities in India and across South Asia themselves are not terribly rare. But at
Yeah.
that particular moment, there had been a range of officials and proponents of the idea of kind of replicating US Homeland Security in the Indian context prior to 2008, but they were broadly, I argue in the book, not getting very far. So you'd see occasionally, for example, an op-ed by some sort of intelligence official or so on calling for India to sort of take terrorism more seriously and try to sort of replicate the alleged success of the Americans in the Indian context. But prior to that moment, things were not really going very far in that direction. But at that particular moment, all of a sudden, these long-standing calls in sort of relatively smaller corners started to gain incredibly unprecedented momentum and started to sort of coalesce into a sort of broadly understood sort of national project that the state needed to do something different.
Hmm.
And at that moment, sort of Homeland Security, the term and kind of the imperative of defending the homeland went from sort of relative obscurity in India to sort of center stage. And so I argue that that moment sort of was a political moment. It was very disruptive. For example, a number of top ministers in the national and state government of Maharashtra were kicked out of office. They had to resign. And there was sort of a general sense that something was afoot, something was changing. And there was sort of seemed to be broad consensus that this thing called Homeland Security needed to sort of be put to center stage and sort of to devote the necessary resources and imperatives to kind of bring it into existence.
Someone could argue that that itself is not fabricating, that's just kind of like a cause and effect. Where would the fabrication part come in?
I think you can see it in a couple of ways. I mean, the book, as we'll talk about, I think a bit later, is, f focuses extensively on the efforts of Israel's homeland security industry, which is a major part of the global homeland security industry to try to get into India. And it traces the efforts of that industry in particular to push into India and other parts of the world as well. But I think what's interesting, the fabrication part, is that it's basically like, as I show in the book in different ways, the Israelis and many other foreign actors had long been trying to do just that, but they needed this moment in order to sort of get the momentum that they had long been craving and looking for, but had not yet been able to succeed at successfully putting together. And one of the reasons that, Israel sort of was center stage in that is because of their own efforts during the Mumbai attacks themselves to kind of very, very actively intervene. And in many ways were part and parcel of creating the political firestorm that followed the attacks.
Hmm.
So, they went on live television and criticized the Indian officials for not doing enough, for being weak and incompetent, as they were, ultimately, at least for some time, the sort of beneficiaries of their own actions to kind of push the Indian state to act and take this thing called Homeland Security more seriously. So the fabrication part is, basically about how that was sort of put together in such a way that the event came to mean that there was a lack of this thing called Homeland Security, and in turn that there was the need to sort of adopt it or replicate it in order to respond to this particularly catastrophic event.
So, does India turn towards Israel or does Israel kind of lure India in? And what role does Israel play in this like global stage of homeland security industry? Am I calling it right, homeland security industry, or should I call it the military industrial complex? Because I think they are hand in hand the same thing, or one is in the other.
I'll start with your last question first, because I
Okay.
think, yeah, right. So, I mean, the term military industrial complex is, much, much older than Homeland Security. And I would certainly say that the Homeland Security industry is absolutely part of the military industrial complex. But I guess I would say that it's sort of a smaller subset of it in the sense that it's primarily concerned not with sort of massive conventional weapons production systems like missiles or bombs, and is instead sort of geared more towards technologies and weapons and practices that are more specific to sort of domestic policing, at least ostensibly. So it certainly is part and parcel of the military industrial complex in all of the ways that that term connotes, in the sense that it's about the production of profit. It's about trying to sort of create demand for this for-profit industry, but it is sort of more specifically geared towards a certain aspect of the broader sort of security architecture that states have, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of your other question, I think it was sort of like about, did India ask for Israel to come or the other way around?
Yeah.
Um, I think it's a really important question and one that really surprised me in doing the research for the book. When I first set out to do this project quite some time ago, my impression was kind of, the general storyline that I think most people are familiar with, that you have this massive attack and then you have a state that looks weak and incompetent and is being criticized, and therefore they go out looking for so-called solutions. And Israel, for various reasons, is sort of front and center in
Yeah.
terms of the options that they went in search of. But the story that I tell in the book is actually much more surprising and much more complicated in the sense that like it was as much pushed on India as they did ultimately gravitate to Israel for certain things. But the initial impulse to learn from Israel or to replicate the so-called Israeli model was really, in large part, at least initially, a product of Israeli state and corporate action to try to sort of basically force India to capitulate and accept the solutions that they had long been somewhat resistant to. So I guess it's a bit of both, but I was surprised about the extent of that effort by the Israelis to sort of force themselves on a country that seemed to be less than enthusiastic, at least initially.
Wow. There's a book called In the Palestine Laboratory by Anthony Lowenstein, where he argues that Israel uses the occupied Palestine territories as a kind of a testing ground for weapons and surveillance, making their technologies better, using it on Palestinians before selling them around the world. You add another layer to it. You argue that Israel is carefully staging, narrating, and marketing itself as a security expert. They're all about creating an image of mastery, telling a story that we are the best at this because of our unique situation. Can you give specific examples of how Israel turns its history of violence into a kind of security brand that it sells to countries like India?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, Anthony's work is fantastic, and there's been a number of people who've been making similar arguments for some time. And I think, the point he makes is a really, really important one, which is to say that the occupation of Palestine and the ongoing, for, at the present moment, the genocide in Palestine, but much more broadly, in sort of the Zionist colonization of Palestine, the efforts by the Israelis to try to pacify Palestinians have been turned into kind of case study or example, where they try to sort of leverage their so-called experience as a kind of additional feather in their cap to kind of differentiate themselves from other potential players in the global security industry and also more broadly the weapons industry. I guess though, like sort of as your question alludes to, I guess what I do a little bit differently in the book is I sort of pause for a second to say, how did that image come to be so solidified? Why is it that when people think about, for example, counterterrorism or security, they think of the Israelis as being sort of preeminent or sort of leading edge in some ways?
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of, in many ways, suggest that it's not entirely obvious why that is the case, not least of which is the fact that, the conflicts they have with different actors, including their efforts against Palestinians, are not in any way settled and are, remain ongoing, as you know. And so I sort of try to trace it historically to think about when the key moments were that that image sort of started to come into the world. And I begin really with sort of like the late 19th century of the early efforts of Zionist settlers to colonize Palestine and their narratives of what I call kind of Israeli exceptionalism, namely the efforts to kind of explain away their attempts to colonize Palestine to a wider world.
Mm-hmm.
And I trace that kind of over time from the late 19th century onward. But as I show in the book, it took quite a while for that image of that whole enterprise being a success story to kind of coalesce. And there are particular pivotal moments where it sort of began to become more solidified in the way that we understand it today. And a crucial moment, I argue, is 1967, which was the Six-Day War, of course, where Israel defeated a number of its regional Arab neighboring states in a sort of very decisive military victory. And I argue that after 1967, that was a sort of pivotal moment in sort of shifting the global image of Israel as a state that was in some ways struggling for its existence to one that had sort of triumphed over its adversaries. But there's also a number of other significant moments that I trace in the book that I think are somewhat less known, and I think illustrate the sort of complex dynamic between sort of the ongoing nature of the violence of the Zionist project, but
Yeah.
also the way that it's sort of explained or explained away.
If you were naive and you were reading the media, it would sound like they're just one country is trying to help another country protect itself from the bad guys. But if we were to open the door, we'd see that like this is not defensive, this is offensive, which, Israel does that a lot. So basically, what has Israel sold to India and what is it being used for?
Right. So I think it's important to kind of put this in a broader perspective. So there's
Sure.
like, as I began to sort of elaborate already, there is, the distinction is somewhat arbitrary, but it does exist, and I think it does matter to some extent. So, Israel has been selling India what are generally called conventional weapons for a very long time. Although they only established formal diplomatic ties in the 1990s, their actual covert efforts and successful efforts to sell India weapons date back, to the very early days of the post-independence period and have continued on since then.
Hmm.
And so, from that period onward, Israel has sold India at a binational level all kinds of conventional weapons, including, patrol boats, most recently UAVs and bombs and missiles, laser guided things, also assault rifles and so on that are used by Indian army forces as well as paramilitary forces in places like Kashmir. What changed to some extent that has continued, since the 90s and grown steadily ever since. And as some of your listeners will know, Israel or India rather is, the biggest single larger buyer of Israeli conventional weapons.
Yeah.
After 2611, though, the thing that I sort of focus on in the book primarily is not those things, and is rather the homeland security technologies and repertoires that are specifically geared more towards domestic use. So, domestic policing in the sense of, policing major cities like Delhi or Mumbai, that kind of thing. And the things that the Israelis were keen to sell the Indian actors included a range of things, including sort of police training. So for those of you, your listeners who are familiar with Mumbai attacks, one of the things that was widely criticized was the lack of adequate commando units, for example. So the pushes was to try to sort of train local forces in places like the state of Maharashtra and the city of Mumbai, where local emergent sort of commando units were trained by Israeli forces and private companies. Other things that they were looking to sell, were sort of like, broad surveillance programs, as well as kind of physical infrastructure things like security bollards, anti-crash bollards, gates, that kind of stuff, as well as a range of other things, including, cybersecurity, the technology Pegasus, which I believe India bought from Israeli actors in 2017, I believe.
Yeah.
Uh, that that is all sort of also in the realm of homeland security in the sense that it's being used on domestic actors, people who are labeled as activists or dissidents, who the Indian state would like to police or incarcerate or sort of go after in some ways.
For people who don't know what Pegasus, can you elaborate the how powerful this technology is, this weapon is?
It's profound that it's been, weaponized with enormous efficiency in the Indian context. So, I mean, the technology itself is basically something that infects your phone and sort of compromises it and enables state actors to essentially, spy on you and follow you and potentially use the information that you're sharing with others against you in criminal proceedings and so on. It was, developed by an Israeli company called NSO Group and has been sold to a range of countries around the world. But in the Indian context, if you ever talk to any people who are politically active or activists, you'll notice right away how incredibly wary they are of,
Hmm.
community and online forums, and that's not an accident. It is largely because of sort of what we've come to learn about the effect of Pegasus on kind of compromising people's phones and enabling the Indian state to, yeah, spy on people and invade their lives in different ways.
If Israel markets itself as an expert, what does October 7th do to his image? And right now we have a recent attack in Kashmir. I don't know if you heard about it.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned October 7th, and I think it's, strangely glossed over how significant it was as a moment, particularly in relation to these types of things. I think it's interesting that, basically this entire infrastructure of pacification that the Israelis have built around Gaza and other places in Palestine has, prior to that moment had been leveraged as a sort of resounding success story. And, foreign delegations were taken to look at, the border wall, the separation barrier there to sort of showcase it to the world as an example of sort of being impenetrable or sort of um, helping to secure Israelis. And I think, October 7th showed very clearly in real time how fragile in many ways that whole infrastructure was to the efforts by Hamas and other actors to kind of basically just bulldoze right through it and sort of walk straight into the territories that were understood to be secure.
Hmm.
And that was a majorly that was a majorly destabilizing effect for a variety of reasons. But it's the Israelis have been attempting to sort of not sort of remember that and sort of continue to boast that they have all the answers to these kinds of things. So I mean, back to the fabrication question, I think it shows that, something that looks very solid and solidified and secure all of a sudden sort of comes undone at this particular moment and shows itself to be not nearly as stable or all-encompassing or effective as, its proponents would have us believe.
Right.
I think what's happening in Kashmir now in the last few days, and I've been, following it quite closely, is interesting in a variety of ways, but particularly in relation to the Mumbai attacks and 26/11, you see a lot of the same kinds of stories repeating themselves. So, I mean, the targets seem to be primarily Indian tourists who were in Kashmir, and they were, apparently attacked by people that we don't really know who they were, but, broadly it's being blamed on Pakistan and Pakistani actors. And there's been a lot of discussion in Indian media and other global media these past few days about implying that, why wasn't this site protected? How was it that these guys could kind of just walk up and massacre, I think, 26 people in broad daylight? And it's being suggested that, this was some sort of gross intelligence failure or some sort of major lapse of the Indian state to protect its own citizens in Kashmir,
Yeah.
which is, of course, occupied territory. But I think that whole discussion really misses the point. Of course, the families of the people who've been killed, it's a massive tragedy for them, of course. But the idea that, a place as remote as Kashmir could sort of be simply policed so effectively that no one would be able to get in or attack people itself is really kind of quite laughable. And I think, yeah, that the pretense that everything could have been different had security been taken seriously, quote unquote, is really a story that uh, we shouldn't indulge too much.
During these exchanges between India and Israel, training, business contracts, weapons contracts, joint projects, what did the relationship between Indian and Israeli officials actually look like? What kinds of tensions or dynamics stood out to you?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. I mean, some of them, in the book, I trace a number of linkages that happen between Israeli actors and Indian, mostly state actors. One of them involved, for example, a delegation visit by the government of Maharashtra to Palestine, Israel, in 2009. So basically, a bunch of cops and government officials went to visit Israel and sort of behold the so-called Israeli model in real life and tried, the premise of that was to sort of like get inspired by what Israel was doing and potentially replicate it in the state of Maharashtra. And I think, some of the things that they told, I talked to some of the actors that were involved, both in hosting the delegation, the Israeli counterparts, as well as the Indian actors who traveled to Palestine, Israel at that time. And some of the things that they said didn't surprise me that much. For example, there's a lot of discussion around sort of this common problem of Muslims in both places that need to be policed and othered and sort of pacified.
Hmm.
Uh, and the Indian actors seem to suggest that they could see obvious parallels between the way in which Israel polices Palestinians and potentially in a place like Mumbai with such a large Muslim population, they saw parallels between the sort of terrorist other in both cases. But what surprised me a lot actually was sort of the tensions that also unfolded in those relationships. So it ended up being not especially seamless at all. And there were major disagreements around a range of things. I mean, I think first and most broadly, there was a lot of skepticism on the Indian side about whether Israeli approaches were, in fact, as universal or applicable to India as many had been led to believe, and particularly the Indian police and government actors that I talked to raised a lot of questions about the extent to which the so-called Israeli model could, in fact, be replicated in a city like Mumbai of a radically different scale and proportion to the kinds of problems that the Israelis claim to be able to manage.
Yeah.
But there are also other things that were also quite unexpected in terms of the contestations around authority. So I got the sincere impression that they did not see eye to eye in terms of how to do domestic security, but they also didn't get along terribly well in terms of working together, in the sense that the Israelis, I think, imagined themselves to be sort of the all-seeing experts, and they would be sort of greeted with open arms by their Indian counterparts. But that really was not what went down. And I think in various ways their expert credentials were sort of contested and not taken at face values, which the Israelis didn't much like, as you could probably gather. And
Tension.
so, yeah, many of those Israeli firms that had imagined themselves to be able to find, partners in India ended up coming back empty-handed and basically decided to leave India altogether because they couldn't get the kinds of deals and profits that they were in search of. So that really did surprise me.
You also spend a lot of time at security expos in India, places where companies show off their products to police and government buyers. What did those events feel like? Were they really about safety, or were they about selling an image?
As you can probably, they varied a little bit. I think, it's worth saying that some of them were these massive expos with, thousands of participants and hundreds of firms presenting at them in these, huge sort of expo halls in places like Noida, just outside of Delhi, for example. Others were in sort of small hotels, quite obscure, seemingly almost questionable in terms of their geopolitical importance. But all of them were sort of united by their general sort of corporate flavor. I mean, they were quite sanitized spaces where people were sort of giving these canned lines on their various products and services and the kinds of things that they could resolve. So I mean, I think like most sort of trade expos, they sort of had that sort of profit-seeking, very sort of corporatist discussions. But at the same time, some of the programming that I attended at these events, so they had both stalls where different companies could kind of present their wares and try to find potential people who wanted to buy them. But they also had some of these same people presenting on stages and sort of talking about the broader contours of Indian Homeland Security and the kinds of problems that they could be used to fix. And in those kind of discussions, there was a lot of discussions about sort of, again, unexpected things that I wasn't really anticipating in terms of, like, for example, things I talked about before, sort of the differences between Western and Indian ways of doing security and sort of ruminating on various forms of sort of cultural and geographic difference that they had to sort of transcend or try to sort of ameliorate in different ways.
Yeah.
So yeah, although they were sort of very clean sort of corporate spaces, the things that were said at them weren't always entirely on script, I guess.
Well, aside from, weapons and surveillance technology, what about selling things like strategies and for example, if you were to criticize Israel, you would be called anti-Semitic. That's a good way of like trying to stop that argument. There are these talking points of occupation and colonization. Do they discuss these political tricks and sneaky attacks, ways to kind of stop people from saying things and try to keep everything hidden and under the wraps. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if I'm making sense.
I do. I mean, I think like the way I would answer it is like, I think what's important to note is that these events, they are selling literal technologies, weapons, surveillance systems, all that kind of stuff. But there's also a whole range of other services that are being sold,
Yeah,
and consulting is a big one.
consulting.
That ranges from everything in terms of, how to manage your municipality or how to set up a control room or how to train your special forces. But it also involves a lot of other things as well, including some of the things you're kind of alluding to. So, I mean, some different contractors sell different things. but sometimes they have a toolbox they claim that is, far exceeds simply police training. So, for example, I talked to Israeli police trainers that claim to sort of be able to help you understand Arabic culture or Arabic language. And I mean, I think in many ways their claims to know these other cultures or these other worlds are often quite questionable and shouldn't be taken at their words, but there's certainly there's these sort of claims to sort of cultural expertise that they can help you with. And I think also, I mean, this isn't something that I really talk about a lot in the book, but certainly trying sort of geopolitical expertise or sort of how to outmaneuver your enemy or grand strategy. Those are all things that are, there's certainly people out there selling them,
Mm-hmm.
though those particular narratives are not necessarily the ones that I focus on in the book, but like there's a whole swath of that kind of so-called expertise that is being sort of bandied around and being suggested as sort of the secret ingredient to solving your various, police problem or geopolitical problem or something.
Right. You say that companies are trying to educate desire to teach Indian officials to want these products. How exactly do they do that? And what kind of India are they imagining or pushing towards with this model of security?
Yeah, so I mean, a whole chapter of the book is really about trying to what I call sort of educate the Israeli or Indian rather Homeland Security market. And again, this is something that I was not expecting to, I did not set out to research. It sort of came to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in broad strokes, there was a sense basically that although India suffers from a range of problems related to political violence, there's a sense, particularly in the global homeland security industry, that they're not taking it seriously enough, or they're not sort of using sufficient, sort of making sufficient resources available to manage said problem. And so a lot of these events focused on trying to sort of, in their words, like educate the market. So that, involved things like simply trying to make would-be buyers aware of different so-called solutions. So, the idea was basically if you have a big trade expo and you have these police officials there, they'll become aware of things that they didn't know existed. And if they become aware of their existence, then they might be more willing or able to purchase them, right? So that's kind of the most basic frame. But education also worked on a much more fundamental level in terms of, like you were alluding to, trying to sort of, create the underlying desire for these things, and the sense that they should be more of a priority to the Indian state than they currently are. But education also involved trying to sort of reconcile things that I was talking about earlier in the sense of, how do you sort of emulate a state like Israel in the Indian context? How do you sort of take something that may or may not work there and try to sort of blend it into a different context or make it function in a comparable way elsewhere?
Yeah.
And so education, I say in the book in different ways, is kind of like an effort to kind of try to transcend difference or trying to work with these various forms of difference, as well as trying to sort of increase the overall desire and perceived desirability of these various homeland security solutions.
You brought an interesting point. Homeland security, you describe it as something fragile, unfinished, and often improvised. Why is it important to understand that this isn't a clean global model, but something really messy and constantly being patched together?
So I think, it matters in a lot of ways. I mean, I think where we started our conversation in terms of like, how does this thing, Homeland Security, come to look whole,
Yeah.
coherent, and desirable? And when we look at it from a distance, it sort of seems obvious that everyone should want this thing, and that it is something that every state or every person in the world should desire or should want. And I guess the way that I looked at it, if we pay attention to how um, basically how the homeland security industry works, we can kind of understand the various forms of labor that are involved in trying to, ultimately making it look coherent, even though it's often falling apart and sort of full of holes and that kind of thing. I think it also matters in terms of the transnational elements, which is a big focus of the book. So, despite its name, Homeland Security, I argue in different ways, is really just a matter of the homeland itself. So although it sort of manifests often in particular localities or particular domestic spaces, it's always already sort of circulating around the world. And those circulations are sort of part and parcel of what I call its fabrication, in the sense that, for it to exist, it has to be circulating, there have to be these different actors buying and selling it. They have to be making the case that it is in fact relevant here and there, and being sort of doing the work to make it look replicable in these different sites.
Hmm.
Um, I think it also matters in terms of like, if we think about potentially sort of resistance to state power or pacification projects or, efforts to make worlds that are not security states. I think when we think about those things, the sort of tensions and the rifts and the patchiness is worthwhile. So I mean, in terms of, where are the pressure points? Where are the things that, possibly can be contested? Um, is this something that we should in fact desire? You know, those kinds of political questions, I guess. So in many ways, I think the focus on how it's pieced together also helps us to think about trying to create a different kind of world or different kinds of worlds that might organize life in ways that I think are less repressive and less, beholden to the military industrial complex.
Make us maybe more safer.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, ultimately, I think like, security and safety are really not the same thing. Like,
Yeah,
security is not about protecting ordinary people from the things that harm us. And, the word security connotes that, but I think that's not something we should indulge, basically.
preemptive strikes falls into Homeland Security, right? Like let's blow them up before they might blow us up later. Like things like that, like drones and yeah, things like let's kill those people before they might kill us, but let's just kill them now. Like that's Homeland Security, pretty much.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, I mean, although technically those are sort of like conventional military operations, absolutely, it's important to note that particularly in the early days of the war on terror, when places like Afghanistan and Iraq were being, bombed relentlessly rather, that was literally all being done in the name of Homeland Security.
That's
The
that.
claim was the only way we can protect ourselves here is to, basically bomb them abroad. And so the word Homeland Security and the imperative of Homeland Security became really the chief rationalization to carry out those military and counterinsurgency campaigns abroad.
That's insane. What do you hope readers in South Asia, especially India, take away from this book? What should we be thinking about when it comes to fear, safety, and who security really serves? I think kind of answered that question previously, but we can kind of go again.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I mean, I think basically like one thing that I'll say is like I think for anyone who works on India, it's often seen as a kind of exception. It's, often seen as a place that's incredibly insecure and sort of out of step with sort of the global standard of how a state should organize itself in terms of domestic policing and so on. And there are certainly certain specificities and particularities of the Indian context that may, in fact, be somewhat unique. Its inheritance of sort of British Empire and the infrastructure of sort of colonial control has endured in a way in India that is quite distinct from other places, particularly Palestine, for example, although they were both colonized places under British control. The way that that's played out in the Indian context is rather different in many respects than the way that it's played out in other locations. But I think the broader message that I would like people to take away from the book really is that like, what I call the fabricated nature of Homeland Security in India, the fact that it is sort of visibly fractured and fractious. So in, one example that I tell in the book is you go to a city like Mumbai, for example, they bought all these scanners around the railway station and they're installed in such a way that you can literally walk around them. And so the sort of illusion of security is sort of right before your eyes. Like everybody knows that it's impossible basically to secure the suburban lines that, enable commuters to come across the city to work and so on. And so, pretty much nobody believes that the city of Mumbai is secure despite buying all this stuff. But I think that that makes visible something that's more broadly true about security projects is that they're really not all that they seem. I mean, you can kind of see this. I was traveling recently, and it's always amazing when you travel through different airports, just the completely arbitrary nature of the procedures that you have to go through in one place, but not another. Some places want you to take your shoes off, some places want you to take your belt off,
Yeah.
and then go to another airport on the same day in a different country, and all of a sudden they, they want your shoes on or what. I mean, like all this stuff is really mostly just to sort of, you know, create a sense of order. It doesn't, it doesn't really achieve the things that it set out to do. But I think what the Indian context makes visible is that more general tendency of security projects. And I think it helps us sort of more broadly sort of unpack and kind of take apart that which seems sort of totally coherent and whole, I guess.
Right. Let me just add in one more question. Manufacturing consent. That plays a big part in homeland security projects or missions. For example, with the Iraq thing, we had like, this country has weapons of mass destruction. We need to take it over. The media started, projecting that. Does when we talk about homeland security, we should also talk about the press. Is the press kind of involved in this too? Is there a way that something like Israel will go to India and be like, this is how you need to control your free press and get these articles out, and this is how you get this is the ways to do things. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know. I mean, yeah, I mean, absolutely. The press plays an enormous role in this. And I think it's like in the case of the Mumbai attacks, one story that I sort of tell is the efforts of people in the wake of the attacks to sort of ask different kinds of questions that the state didn't want to ask, which, up to and including who really did carry this out, and what does it really mean? And is this thing called Homeland Security really something that we should desire or want, or, is it even really possible, I suppose? And as I chronicle in different ways, the people who were trying to ask those questions and did ask those questions in the immediate wake um, of the attack, including, the family members of people who were killed, for example, the widows of them, and so on, as well as other actors, were quite violently suppressed,
Yeah.
and their voices were profoundly unwelcome, and they were just told that they had no place in the discussion about what was to be done. And in that effort to kind of just sell a single narrative about cause and effect, this thing happened and therefore X, I
Mm-hmm.
think an enormous amount was lost. But there were also actors at that time, and I sort of come to in the conclusion of the book, people like Arundhati Roy, for example, who right from the outset said, this is not what it seems, and it's also not going to work in the way that the architects of Homeland Security would have us believe. And it turned out that, pretty much every single word that they wrote turned out to be 100% correct. So I think it's important to sort of return to those voices after the fact and realize that, many people could kind of see through it and were not sort of duped by the sort of hegemonic narratives that prevailed.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, with what's happening in Kashmir again, there's a really significant need to pause and ask those very simple but also, tough questions about, when you're insinuating that this is happening and this is why it's happening, on what basis is this happening? How do we actually know about this? Should we be taking these things at face value? And relatedly, how does the prevailing narrative compel us to act sometimes in ways that are both possibly futile, but also potentially very dangerous and counterproductive?
Thank you so much for being here and explaining this to us. Your book is amazing and it's very, very eye-opening.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much.